The first thing Noah Vance heard was the silence between the notes. The string quartet was playing something Elena had chosen months ago from a list she had sent him on a Tuesday afternoon with a voice note attached, her humming the melody so he would recognize it when he heard it properly. And he had listened to that voice note 4 times because he liked the sound of her being unguarded and unhurried. The music filled the chapel now with the full version of what she had hummed, and the guests were rising from their seats in the slow collective motion of 200 people responding to the same cue, and the light through the stained glass was doing exactly what the photographer had promised it would do at this hour on this day. And Noah Vance stood at the altar and felt, in the specific quiet beneath all of it, that his life had arrived at the place it had been building toward. He had been building toward this for a long time. Not recklessly. Not with the blind momentum of a person moving toward something because movement felt like progress, but with the deliberate and patient construction of a man who had decided what mattered and had organized himself accordingly. He was 32 years old, and he had learned, through the years before Elena, that steadiness was not the absence of passion but its most durable form, and he had found in her someone who received that steadiness as the gift it was rather than the limitation it sometimes appeared to people who confused intensity with meaning. Callum stood beside him and said nothing, which was the correct thing. Callum had been his best friend for 11 years and understood the grammar of his silences well enough to know that this one did not need filling. The chapel doors opened. She was there in the light of the doorway for 1 second before she resolved from silhouette into the woman he knew, and in that second Noah felt something he did not have language for, the full weight of what it meant to love a specific person and to have arrived at the public declaration of that love with every intention intact. She was radiant. He did not reach for a better word because the better word did not exist. She was exactly Elena, and she was walking toward him, and for the first 4 seconds everything was the ceremony he had planned and the future he had built and the life he was certain of. On the 5th second, her eyes moved left. It was small. A trained observer positioned elsewhere in the chapel might not have caught it. But Noah had spent 14 months developing the specific fluency of a man who loved a woman and paid attention to her face because her face was one of his favorite things in the world to read. He caught it the way you catch a sound in a familiar house that is slightly wrong, not because it is loud, but because you know the normal sounds so well that the deviation registers immediately. Her eyes found the 3rd row. Her pace changed. Something came alive in her expression that the 200 candles and the flower arrangements and the full orchestrated beauty of this day had not produced, and Noah looked at the 3rd row and saw his brother, and looked back at Elena, and in the space of one breath the architecture of his certainty began to develop a crack that ran from the surface all the way to the foundation. She stopped walking. The music continued without her for 5 beats. Then 6. The first violinist was the one who noticed first and stopped, and the others followed in the specific ragged way of people responding to an unexpected condition without a rehearsed protocol, and the silence that fell over the chapel was the kind that happens when 200 people receive the same information at the same moment and none of them have processed it into language yet. Elena stood 14 feet from the altar. She turned. She walked toward the 3rd row. The sound that came from the chapel in the next 3 seconds was not a single noise but a texture, the combined and uncoordinated response of 200 people who had arrived expecting one story and were being handed another one in real time. Noah heard it the way a person hears distant weather, present and registered but not yet fully real. He stood at the altar and watched Elena Maris walk toward his brother, and he did not move. Not because he had decided to be still. Because the signal from his mind to his body was passing through a disturbance that did not yet have a name. Callum's hand found his arm. Noah did not feel it. If this is your first time here, subscribe right now. Because this story earns everything it asks of you. To understand the full weight of what happened in that chapel, you have to understand what Noah had built before it. He had not been a man who came to love easily or quickly. There had been relationships before Elena that had taught him, through the specific curriculum of things that do not work out, what he was actually looking for, which was not a particular appearance or a particular ambition or any of the external specifications that younger men sometimes organize their searching around. What he was looking for was someone who was fully present in a room. Someone whose attention, when it landed on you, was complete. Someone who did not require performance from you because they were not performing themselves. Elena had been all of these things. He had met her at a friend's gathering where the party had naturally migrated to the kitchen in the way parties always do, toward warmth and surfaces and the kind of conversation that requires proximity. She had been talking to someone when he walked in, and she had paused mid-sentence to ask him a question, not as a social technique, but because she was genuinely curious what he thought, and the genuineness of it had been the thing that made him stay in that kitchen for 2 hours when he had planned to be there for 40 minutes. They had built steadily. That was the word he used when people asked, steadily, with the particular meaning of something constructed carefully and without gaps, where each layer was allowed to set before the next one was placed. Her warmth, his patience, her humor, which was dry and specific and arrived without warning. His way of listening, which she said made her feel like the thing she was saying was worth the space it was taking up. Her family had been complicated and his had been straightforward, and they had navigated the difference with the honest negotiation of two people who have decided that the negotiation is worth it. He had never been more certain of anything than he was the morning of the wedding. Adrian had come back into their lives 5 months before the ceremony, after 2 years in 3 different cities doing the kind of work that Adrian described as consulting and that Noah had always understood to mean the specific entrepreneurial restlessness of a man who is talented enough to be useful in many places and committed enough to none of them. He was 3 years younger than Noah and had always been the Vance who inhabited the world differently, not worse, not irresponsibly, just differently, with a tolerance for edges and uncertainties that Noah had never shared and had never needed to share because they were different people with different relationships to risk. Adrian had arrived at the engagement party and met Elena and been charming and warm and entirely himself, which was a self that most people found magnetic, and Noah had watched his brother meet his future wife and felt nothing except the ordinary pleasure of 2 people he loved occupying the same room. This was what he would return to in the weeks after the chapel, not with anger, but with the specific inquiry of a man trying to understand what he had missed and why. He had felt nothing except pleasure. He had looked at Adrian and Elena in the same room and found it uncomplicated, and the question he sat with was whether the uncomplicated feeling was evidence of nothing to see or evidence of a man who had been so committed to his own certainty that he had stopped looking. Drop a comment right now if you know exactly what that question feels like to sit with. Because Noah is about to find the answer. Elena had understood the situation she was in from the 3rd Sunday dinner. Not from the first time she met Adrian, which had been genuinely uncomplicated, the meeting of a future brother-in-law in a social setting where nothing was asked of her except ordinary warmth. Not from the 2nd Sunday dinner either, where the conversation had been easy and general in the way of people finding the social calibration of a new family relationship. But the 3rd dinner, when something in the texture of her attention had shifted in a way she noticed and did not immediately name, but could not honestly misidentify, she had understood with the clarity of a woman who has a precise relationship with her own interior life that she was in a situation that was going to require a decision. She had not made the decision. This was the central fact of the 5 months, the fact beneath all the other facts, the one that everything else was arranged around. She had understood that a decision was required, and she had not made it, which is itself a decision but one that allows the person making it to maintain the fiction that they are still in the pre-decision phase, still gathering information, still in the process of arriving at a conclusion that has not yet been reached. What she had gathered, across 5 months of Sunday dinners and family occasions, and the accumulated ordinary proximity of a man who had moved back into the family orbit at exactly the wrong moment, was the specific knowledge of 2 different kinds of feeling, and what they gave her, and what they cost her. Noah gave her safety and constancy and the warm, reliable quality of a love that did not fluctuate or demand performance. She had valued this genuinely. She was not going to revise that valuation because it was true, and because revising it would have required her to build a version of herself she had not designed. Adrian gave her something else. The specific aliveness of being around someone who produced in her a version of herself she had put somewhere during the long and patient process of becoming the woman who was right for the steady love. A version that was louder and less managed and less interested in the cost of taking up space. She had buried this version with some intention, because the version was not convenient for the life she was building, and Adrian's return had unearthed it in the specific way of things that have been buried rather than resolved. She had wanted both. Not as a permanent arrangement, not with the explicit knowledge that she was choosing to manage two simultaneous situations, but in the soft daily practice of a person who keeps choosing not to close a door because closing it feels like a loss that the current moment does not require. The wedding had seemed, for months, like a natural point of resolution, the ceremony itself acting as a kind of gravity that would pull everything into order. She had told herself this across the invitations and the deposits and the fittings with the specific fluency of self-deception that becomes available when intelligent people apply their intelligence to the project of not seeing what they are doing. Adrian had said choose. He had said it in the kitchen of his parents' house, which was not the right room for the conversation but was the room they were in, and he had said it with the directness of a man who had decided that whatever else he was willing to be, he was not willing to be managed. I need you to decide, he said. Before the wedding. That's the available window, and it's closing. I know the window, she said. Do you know what you want? I know what I feel. That's not the same thing, he said. What you feel about two different people is not the same as knowing what you want. One of them is information. The other one is a choice. He looked at her with the focused attention of a man who has been on the edge of rules long enough to recognize when someone else is standing there. Which one are you making? She had not answered him. He had not pushed that day, but the ask remained present in every subsequent interaction, the specific pressure of a question that does not expire simply because it is not being repeated. What Elena had been doing in the space of the unanswered question was not, if examined honestly, simply the paralysis of genuine ambiguity. She was constructing something. Not with a blueprint, not in the cold explicit way of a person sitting down to engineer an outcome, but in the way that people build the things they will not admit to wanting, through a series of small decisions that each present as individual and are collectively directed. She did not want to be the person who had conducted an affair through her entire engagement and then ended it privately, in a room, in a conversation, in the ordinary, undramatic way of someone choosing between two things. That version left her as the agent of the choice, the person who had done the thing and was now ending it, and the cost of that version to her self-image was more than she was willing to pay. She wanted a different version. She wanted the version in which she was the woman who could not be false at the critical moment, the woman who arrived at the altar and found, in the full sight of everyone who mattered, that truth was more powerful than comfort. The woman who is brave enough to honor her heart at maximum personal cost. This version required an audience. The altar provided the best audience available. She had not told Adrian she was going to stop in the aisle. She had told him she was going to choose him, which was true, and she had mentioned the seating assignment for the third row, and she had not told the ushers to redirect him if he arrived after the seating had been organized. These were not the components of a conspiracy, but they were the components of a woman who was not trying to prevent a specific outcome and who understood, without examining it directly, that a specific outcome was being constructed by her inaction. What she had not modeled was Adrian stepping back. Like this video right now if you felt that land. Because the plan is about to cost everyone differently than Elena calculated. The vestry was a small room with old wood and candle smell and the specific quality of religious quiet that persists in the bones of a building even when the circumstances occurring inside it are the opposite of sacred. Noah sat in the chair and Callum sat beside him, and neither of them spoke for several minutes. Callum understood, in the way of long friendship, that the silence was not empty. It was working. Noah was doing something in it that required the space, and he was not going to fill the space with comfort that would interrupt the work. I need to talk to her, Noah said finally. I know, Callum said. I need the actual version, not the version she prepared. I know that too, Callum said. Do you want me to come? No, Noah said. This is a room for two people. He found her in the anteroom beside the chapel entrance, the small upholstered space where she had waited before the processional, and she was sitting on the bench with her flowers beside her and her hands in her lap and the specific quality of a person in the aftermath of an action who is waiting to understand what the aftermath contains. She looked up when he came in, and in her face was the full inventory of what the past 5 months had been built from, the intelligence, the warmth, and the thing beneath both of them that he was only now seeing clearly because he had finally stopped providing the explanation that made it invisible. I don't want to start with sorry, he said. I want to start with the true version. She looked at him carefully. When did it start? He said.
Noah.
That's the first question. When? She held his gaze for 2 seconds. The engagement party, she said. He absorbed this. The information arrived in a place that had been prepared for it without his awareness, as though some part of him had known the number and had been waiting to hear it confirmed. 5 months, he said. Yes. While we were planning this. His hand made a small gesture toward the chapel, the flowers, the whole prepared day on the other side of the wall. Yes. He nodded once, not in forgiveness, not in acceptance, in receipt. The aisle, he said, stopping in the aisle. She looked at her hands. I know you, he said, and the way he said it was not a threat or an accusation but a simple statement of fact, the fact of a man who has spent 14 months in genuine attention to a specific person. I know how your mind works. I know what spontaneous looks like on you, and I know what constructed looks like. What happened in that aisle was not spontaneous. Silence. You needed the witnesses, he said, and his voice had the quality of something arriving clearly for the first time. You needed everyone watching so the story would write itself the way you needed it written. The brave woman at the altar. The impossible love. The truth that couldn't be suppressed. He looked at her steadily. Not the woman who managed 2 situations for 5 months and designed an exit that protected her image while she used it. She looked up. What I feel is real. I believe you, he said, immediately and without qualification. I have never doubted that what you feel is real. What I am telling you is that real feeling and honest behavior are not the same thing, and you used one to replace the other for 5 months and then used an audience of 200 people to make the exit look like courage. Her mouth opened. The honest version, he said, was a private conversation 3 months ago, in a room without an audience. The way I deserved to receive it. That version would have cost you the image of the brave woman at the altar. So you chose the version that gave you both, the choice and the reputation for choosing well. He picked up his jacket from the chair. That's what I needed to understand. He walked to the door. Noah, she said. He stopped but did not turn. I'm sorry, she said.
And she meant it.
The sorrow was real, and he knew it was real, and it was not enough, and they both knew it was not enough. I know, he said. You should have been sorry 3 months ago in a room without cameras. He walked out. Subscribe to this channel right now. Because where Noah goes next is the part of the story that matters most. Adrian was in the garden on the low stone wall, jacket off, forearms on his knees, looking at the gravel the way a man looks at something when he is using the looking to hold himself in a position of reckoning that he would otherwise have difficulty maintaining. He looked up when he heard Noah come through the door, and he stayed looking, which was the most honest thing he had done in 5 months, and Noah registered it. Noah sat on the wall. The distance of 2 men who share the same origin and are trying to figure out whether they share a future. Tell me what you knew, Noah said. Adrian looked at the garden. She told me she was going to choose me, he said. She did not tell me she was going to stop in the aisle with everyone watching. If she had told you. Adrian was quiet for a moment that contained an honest struggle. I want to tell you, I would have stopped it, he said. The true answer is, I don't know. I'd like to believe I would have. I'm not certain enough to say it. That's the first honest thing I've heard today, Noah said. I'm sorry, Adrian said. For all of it. For not being the one who ended it when ending it was still a private matter. For not, he stopped. There's not a version of this where I did the right thing at any point. I know that. I know you know that, Noah said. They sat in the garden with the sounds of the reception that was not happening filtering through the chapel walls and the late afternoon light going the specific gold of early evening. When she stopped in the aisle, Adrian said quietly, and turned toward me, something in the way she looked, I understood that I had been positioned there, that I was the destination of something arranged. And I stepped back because whatever I feel and however real it is, there's a version of a person who can do that, who can use the biggest public moment available to manage how they're seen, that I hadn't understood before I saw it. He looked at his hands. You can't see that and then unsee it. No, Noah said. You can't. A long quiet. We're not okay, Noah said. I want to be direct about that. We're not okay, and I don't know when we will be, and I'm not going to tell you a timeline, because I don't have one. I know, but I'm not walking away from you permanently, Noah said. Not because what you did wasn't serious.
It was.
But because letting this take my brother on top of everything else it's already taken would mean giving it more than it deserves. He stood up. We'll find the rest of this as we go. Adrian looked up at him. Something in his face that was not relief, but was adjacent to it. The specific look of a man who has been given something he did not expect and is not sure yet what to do with it. Noah walked through the gate without looking back, onto the street where the city was conducting its ordinary business with the complete indifference that cities maintain toward the private disasters occurring inside them, and he walked because moving was available and available was enough. A comment below, and tell us the moment that hit you hardest. Because there is still the part about what happens after. And after is where the real story lives. Elena's designed narrative lasted 48 hours. It lasted that long because the first day was chaos, and the second day was the consolidation of chaos, and by the third day people who had been at the wedding were talking to each other, and the talking produced a timeline, and the timeline produced a picture that bore no resemblance to the one she had painted in the aisle. The people in that chapel knew Noah Vance. They had attended Sunday dinners in his family's house and his engagement party, and they had watched him conduct himself across 14 months of loving Elena with the visible investment of a man who was giving the real thing. They had watched his face in the seconds after she turned. And what they assembled from the timeline, from the 5 months and the engagement party and the family dinners, and the full context of what had been running beneath the surface of all of it, was not the portrait of a woman brave enough to choose love at the hardest moment. It was the portrait of a woman who had managed 2 men simultaneously through an entire engagement and chosen the most public exit available because the most public exit provided the most useful narrative protection. She lost the thing she had designed the moment to preserve. Adrian came to her apartment 12 days after the wedding. He came without calling ahead, which was consistent with how he did everything, and he stood in her living room with the specific quality of a man who has been thinking clearly for almost 2 weeks and has arrived at a conclusion he is going to deliver without the softening that would make it easier to dismiss. I've been sitting with one thing, he said. She waited. Not the choice, he said. The choice was yours to make, and I had a role in creating the conditions for it, and I'm not absolving myself of that. The thing I've been sitting with is the method. He looked at her directly. You placed me in that chapel as the destination of a scene you designed, and you did not ask me whether I agreed to be placed there. You made me the evidence of your courage, without my consent. And when I understood that, standing in the aisle watching you walk toward me, I stepped back because a person who does that, who can run 2 situations for 5 months and then use the largest available public stage to manage the exit, is a person I realize I don't know as well as I thought I did. Adrian. The feeling was real, he said. I have said this to myself 100 times, so I wouldn't lose it in everything else. The feeling on both sides was real. But I cannot be with someone I cannot trust, and trust is not something I can locate when I look at what you did and how you did it. He picked up his jacket. I hope you find the version of yourself that tells the truth in private rooms when no one is watching. I think she's in there. I think she got buried somewhere in the process of managing everything, and I think she's worth finding. He looked at her one last time with something that was genuine and tired and honest. I'm sorry for my part. All of it. He left. She stood in the apartment alone, and this was the specific shape of the consequence. Not dramatic. Not externally imposed by someone punishing her. Just the direct and accurate result of the method she had chosen, a method that had been designed to allow her to have what she wanted without paying the cost of the wanting, and had instead produced the cost in full and removed the thing she had wanted to keep. She had the freedom. She had chosen publicly and irreversibly, and she was no longer the woman maintaining 2 simultaneous situations. She was free of all of it. She was also alone in the freedom, which was not the version she had written. Subscribe right now because what Noah builds after this is the reason this story exists. Noah took 3 weeks of genuine quiet. Not performed quiet. Not the quiet of a man demonstrating recovery to an audience. The actual quiet of a man sitting with the full contents of a difficult experience and doing the honest work of understanding what it contained that was his to learn from. He had been wronged. He named this clearly and without diminishment because diminishing it would have been another form of distortion, another layer of interpretation placed over the facts to make them more comfortable. He had loved someone fully, and that love had been taken advantage of across 5 months, and the taking advantage had been conducted with skill and then exited with strategy. This was the fact, and it was specific, and it belonged to the people who had done it. What also belonged to him, in the honest accounting, was the examination of the mode he had operated in. The generous interpretation, applied so thoroughly and so consistently that it had become the primary lens rather than one of several available. He had looked at every signal across 5 months and produced an explanation that resolved the signal into harmlessness, and the explanations had been sincere, which was what made them so effective at blocking the view. This was not the same as being responsible for what was done to him. He was precise about this distinction in the 3 weeks of sitting, because collapsing the distinction would have been a different kind of distortion, the kind that takes what was done to you and turns it into something you did to yourself. He had been betrayed. The betrayal was theirs. What was his was the pattern of looking away from the signals, and the pattern was worth understanding not because it produced the betrayal, but because understanding it was how he carried something forward from something that had cost him this much. He called Adrian in the 4th week. Not because he was ready to have the complete conversation, but because not calling was becoming its own decision, and he had decided to stop making decisions through inaction. "I told you at the chapel that we weren't done," he said. "I still mean that." "I know," Adrian said. "I also want you to know that I understand your part in this differently than I understood it in the garden," Noah said. "Not better. Just more completely. She was not something that happened to you. You had a role, and you know you had a role." "Yes," Adrian said, without qualification. "And I also know that you stepped back in the aisle," Noah said. "When you understood what she'd done, you stepped back. That's not nothing." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "I should have stepped back 5 months earlier." "Yes," Noah said. "You should have." A silence. "We're working with what actually happened," Noah said. "Not the version where everyone did the right thing. The actual version." He paused. "I'll call again when I'm ready for the longer conversation." "I'll be here," Adrian said. Noah put the phone down and sat in the apartment that had been organized around a future that no longer existed and looked at the ordinary objects of his life with the clear eyes of a man who has paid the full tuition for an education and is deciding what to do with the knowledge. He rebuilt. Not at a pace designed for anyone else's observation. Not with the visible arc of a man demonstrating recovery. In the quiet accumulation of days that contained good ordinary things, and the gradual emergence of a version of himself that was different from the version that had stood at the altar, not harder, not sealed, but clearer, in the specific way that clarity arrives when you have paid for it with something real. He gave his full attention to things now in a way that came from having understood what happens when you withhold it. He let the accurate reading stand without covering it with a comfortable one. He received what was actually being communicated rather than what he preferred to hear. These were not dramatic changes. They were the quiet recalibrations of a man learning to see without the filter of a certainty that had been, for all its genuineness, a form of looking away. He met someone, without planning or positioning, in the unhurried way of a man who had stopped organizing himself around the anticipation of the next thing. She was nothing like Elena in the ways that had made Elena difficult to see clearly, and entirely herself in ways that did not require management to sustain, and Noah's ability to recognize and receive this was entirely made possible by having learned, at considerable cost, the difference between the two things. He thought about the chapel sometimes. Not with the raw quality of recent pain, but with the considered quality of a man who has extracted the lesson, and is occasionally still in dialogue with it. He thought about standing at the altar with the music and the light and the 200 witnesses and the certainty that had been so complete and so real and so entirely consistent with a foundation that was not what he believed it to be. And he thought about what the most important thing was. Not the love. The love had been real, and its realness did not unmake itself. Not the betrayal. The betrayal had been specific, and it belonged to the people who committed it. The most important thing was the attention. The decision to look at what is actually there rather than what you have decided to believe is there. Love without that attention is the beautiful chapel with the fresh flowers and the swelling music and the altar where the groom waits with everything he believes. Attention is what you build after the music stops and the guests have gone, and you are left with the truth of what was in the room. Share this story right now with someone who is loving something without fully looking at it. Share it with the person who has been managing something until the management became the whole relationship. Subscribe to this channel because this is what we do here. We tell the stories with real weight and real consequence, and the kind of ending that leaves you somewhere honest rather than somewhere comfortable. Drop a comment below and tell us which moment in this story changed how you understood it. And if you have been here from the opening note of the string quartet, from the doors opening and the light coming through, and the groom waiting with his complete and structural certainty, thank you. You are exactly the reason these stories get made. The altar stands empty. The flowers are still fresh. The promises are still echoing off the stone walls. But no one is left to keep them. She didn't just break a vow. She shattered the trust, the family, and the future built around it. And what remained in the silence was not the story she wrote. It was the one that was always true.